Hello, I'm Sally Pointer. This is part of my series on how to make your knitwear last as long as possible. Now I'm talking in the context of the stockings that many people buy from me, but this works just as well whether you're working with hand-knit sweaters, hats, gloves, things that you've bought from a charity shop and you're wanting to upcycle. Doesn't really matter. If you've got knitwear that needs a little bit of TLC, this is how to do it. There's a series of these videos, each one's going to cover a different technique. This next one tends to happen either immediately after knitting something, or if perhaps your stockings got caught on a thorn or a bramble. So here it's a simple drop stitch. The stitch should have formed here, but it's missed a bar, so it's laddered back a bit. If you'd caught your stocking and it had snapped a stitch here, you'd have had the same effect. These are actually really easy to fix. They may not look at it first, but then they're quite satisfying to do. So your first thing you need to do is ladder up this live stitch. So I've got the stitch that's a working one, and then there's 1, 2 live bars behind it. So all I'm going to do is use a needle just to help pick up the stitch to mend that ladder. So that's looking much better already. That stitch needs to now sit in that hole. And the easiest way to fix this is with duplicate stitch. So I'm going to come 1, 2 wales over. I'm going to put my needle in a few stitches up, and I'm going to aim for the row that will pretty much come out at the same level. Pull your thread through and stop just as that tail starts to disappear in. Don't worry about a tiny little fluffy bit that will vanish later. Now I'm going to follow the path of the existing stitches. So I've come out here, which means I need to come underneath this. I'm going to make sure I go right underneath that tail of yarn, pull my thread through, back into the same hole, come at the next one over. So this is doing 2 things. It's securing the end of my yarn, but it's also making sure, if this had been a broken stitch, that if the tail crept sideways, it doesn't tend to do that often, but if it did, that this row won't ladder down as well. Now the next stitch is going to take us into thin air, and that's where we pick up our mended stitch. Now you sometimes have to guess a little bit as to where this particular stitch is going to come out, but it'll all work out in the end. So we're essentially mended, and now I'm just going to keep following that pattern just for another stitch or 2, just to make sure that tail of yarn is anchored, and like I said, to reinforce. In this case, not a problem, but if it had been a broken stitch, that makes the difference. I tend to go off at an angle for a couple of stitches and then clip off the yarn end flush. Now, because you know where to look, you probably can see that, but I absolutely promise you that once that's had a wash, nobody is going to see that. It's as near to an invisible darn as you can get. I've got another one to do here, so we'll just do 1 more of these mends so you can see clearly what's going on. This one's laddered back a tiny bit further. So start by making sure you've got the live loop. Use the point of the needle to help you ladder up, and sometimes it can take a little bit of fishing around to get the end, but that's okay. Just make sure each stitch is properly on your needle before moving up. If you've got a latch tool, this really speeds things up, but I'm assuming you've only got a basic darning needle. There's my next one. 1 more to go. There's my final stitch, and that's the hole it needs to sink into. So 1 wale, 2 wales of knitting, go in a few stitches up, pull the tail end in, trace a line of the stitching with your needle, and even though the two layers of yarn that you're using are going to be a fraction thicker, it's really not going to notice. Pick up that live loop, finish that stitch, couple more stitches to secure. Now I caught the edge of the next one there, I'm just going to reverse that. I don't want to make this any clumsier than it needs to be. Take my yarn tail through, clip off the end, give it a little wiggle. Yes, you've got a tiny bit of additional thickness there, but in wear, especially once it's been washed, which will fluff up the yarns, that is a really nice functional darn. You get this type of damage quite a lot on fine woolen sweaters, you know, those sort of nice smooth lambswool ones that you get in the shops. Quite often a tiny little bit of damage or a drop stitch will make a little tiny run. That's how you mend that one.